First, I want to start by just talking about my personal love and appreciation for the Nightmare on Elm Street series, and even Freddy as a character, as complicated as that is and still is. If you imagine the Mount Rushmore of horror films for, top-notch villains, Freddy is absolutely going to be on that list. But he's still completely unique to the others. Like Michael Myers is a force, a physical manifestation of a force, and that is how those films play out. Even if you look at Jason, it almost feels like Jason is the force of nature. So Freddy is an accountability tool. Michael Myers, Jason, Chucky, they have motivation, but their motivation is much more carnal because it really does get into blurring that line between what is monstrous and what is not. So if you think you can justify violence, you can, and Freddy's sort of that manifestation. Nothing goes away, it just gets buried. The idea of that is even further fleshed out in Freddy vs. Jason. You finally get to see that level of Freddy in a way that you never have before, using others as a tool to his end. He's very strategic mentally. All the others are not necessarily present mentally. It's programming, it's automated. Their behavior, their efforts, their motivations. Freddy is specific every time. Each and every victim that he comes into contact with, they get their own special brand of accountability. So it varies so much. When you think about Chucky and Michael and Jason, like, do they use different weapons? Sure, especially Chucky. But Jason and Michael are notorious for knife and machete. Very simple. They're just doing brute force. Freddy plays mind games. It's just a really broad universe, and somehow Freddy always remains the outlying piece. He gets his hands dirty, but he gets in here and he knows your greatest fear. That's what I love about Nightmare on Elm Street. It presents us with a physical representation of accountability coming home. So I wanted to take a minute to remind everybody about the THA resources that I've created to help navigate my project. Those resources are THA project principles, THA value tags, THA mind maps, and the THA knowledge sharing guide. You can check those out at your leisure on my website or watch the video, but I wanted to make sure I gave that to everybody before we get into the analysis piece. So here we go. He draws really detailed, realistic portraits of women. And he also knows how to write portraits of women that you probably think are there to perpetuate something, when in fact they're there to get you to acknowledge or accept your biases and your blind spots where victimhood and the female body are concerned. Wes Craven always treated his viewers like they were the smartest people in the room. He never pandered. He never sold you a false reality. In fact, he dug into realities that a lot of people would love to dismiss themselves from, separate themselves from, and flat out pretend didn't occur. And how, in his absence, these marks are so powerful that they can still be drawn from within the genre. And you can see those threads throughout his films from the beginning of his career all the way through to the last film he was involved with before he passed. So in 1972, Wes Craven really shook up the horror scene with Last House on the Left. It was a bombshell because it changed how we conceptualized horror films even coming to the screens. So 1972 is really a precious time because 1968, only a few years before, is when we start to see this real evolution with horror where we're moving out of like fantasy, monsters, creatures. We're moving out of that space and we're moving into the horrors of the real world. We're moving into horror being a little more upfront. So the war is happening in 1972 when this film comes out. And Wes Craven has done interviews confirming that the influence was that. And it's obvious when you watch the film because you're seeing things layered on top of each other that make no sense. This very upbeat music that was coming out at that time. And that's supposed to trigger you to what's happening on the news. It's a matter of not being able to sit with manufactured realities. I'd like to deal with the reality we're in. Last House on the Left was given to the public at the beginning of what we now know was the serial killer boom. But the ongoing struggle for women's rights is intensifying at this moment. That's not a coincidence. It's also forcing us to face the reality of what goes on at home. But I think he's trying to tie together the rage and the anger that you have about being invaded, about being hurt, about being touched without your consent, about being forced into situations, that you could have such an understanding for that while the women around you are fighting. You're not safe because where you go, there's always a threat of violence, and you don't get to pretend it isn't happening as a way to keep it out of your space. We've never gotten anywhere staying safe. And I think horror films are the perfect execution of that. That is part of the message that Wes was trying to get to everyone. Last House on the Left is iconic. I would not suggest anybody just sit down and watch it. The tagline for the film:
The last house on the left. To avoid fainting, keep repeating. It's only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie.
And it was the first horror film that really made me realize there's more to this than people think. The fight a woman is doing at home simply not to die is not less than, because in reality, if you're constantly under the threat of being prey, that's what I like to call a war at home. So obviously the second time that Wes Craven completely revitalized the genre was in 1984 with Nightmare on Elm Street. Wes thought he should put a punctuation mark on the exposition of the death of childhood, and now with Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984, he is getting into the effects. Nightmare on Elm Street takes a lot of cues from what was actually happening culturally. There's all these moments where you're stripping humanity away from a child by treating them like they're not a child. And I don't think that could be any more played out than it is in Nightmare on Elm Street. So, how did the Satanic Panic era come to be? What's interesting is that there were three films that ran near the beginning of the panic that pushed it to its next level. Rosemary's Baby came out in 1968. The Exorcist came out in 1973. And The Omen came out in 1976. Rosemary's Baby is essentially about a woman who's forced to bring a baby to term. The Exorcist is about single parent homes, single mothers, and how that can negatively affect the development of your child. And The Omen was all about a woman who couldn't conceive. So we've gone from this idealistic nature and feel and interpretation of childhood, something that we're imagining, something that we're all talking about, but it's not being lived. It's only being conceptualized. Now, this is important because although 1984 is not the beginning of the death of childhood theme that horror has been playing out pretty much since its existence, there are plenty of films that came out prior. 1956, The Bad Seed. I'm thinking about The Children. 1980. I'm thinking about Bloody Birthday, like 1981. I'm thinking about Kill Baby Kill from 1966. There are plenty of films that get into the death of childhood or the erasure of what childhood is, who fits that mold, who we allow to be a child, and who we absolutely won't tolerate being a child. So 1984 is peak satanic panic time. So during this time, there were a number of people and institutions, mostly preschools, day school, over 12,000 unsubstantiated cases at that time of satanic ritual abuse. The satanic panic era really emphasized the difference between survival panic and moral panic. And satanic panic era was all about the morals, because they wanted to believe in the death of childhood as an inverted experience, using childhood to control adults but also stripping childhood. So this is a present idea when this is happening, when Nightmare on Elm Street is being created and when it's released. So the death of a child or childhood can be symbolic. And, Nightmare on Elm Street might be the king. Make no mistake, the Satanic Panic era was almost the last gasp of childhood. None of these kids' parents are around. And even though Nancy's parents are around, her mom is unavailable because of her addiction and in denial, and also the guilt of the crime she committed years earlier. And her father is in complete denial. But she doesn't really get to have that kind of interaction with them. It's like she's the parent. She's the truth teller. She's the one actually trying to fix things. So Nightmare on Elm Street came out in 1984. So what other things were playing themselves out in culture, in the media at the time of the film's release? In 1984, we also get one of the most divisive criminal cases in the history of America, and that is the Bernard Goetz case,
where a vigilante and his gun brought terror this past weekend. The victims were 4 teenagers. Eyewitness News has been on top of this story from the very start of it, and tonight we have team coverage as police press their search for the vigilante. We begin with Milton Lewis, who spent this day riding with people who trust their lives to the subways every day.
I think he did right.
By shooting these guys.
Sure, they tried to mug him.
Really wrong. I mean, I think I'm a law student.
2 views as police distributed a sketch of the white man sought for the shooting last Saturday afternoon of 4 black male teenagers who allegedly tried to rob him.
He was gone.
I think he was, protecting himself. This is around the Christmas
The
holiday.
reason he felt empowered to do this is crystal clear a few years later. So in 1996, Wes revitalized the genre, probably the best he ever had. So horror films in the late 80s and early 90s, this was a point when people were, 1, sick of slashers, 2, thought that all horror films were slashers. When he released Scream, we are still using the super predator theory. It's definitely dwindling off because eventually it disappears. Well, it disappears from public mention. Once we get to the 90s, we start nailing people with the super predator era, essentially painted black and brown bodies as extremely dangerous to the point that we need a new criminologist term to describe their behavior.
They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel.
The very first speech that I gave back in April was about criminal justice reform and about predators.
You're being rude.
This is not appropriate. This is not appropriate. That's rude. Now, do you want to hear the facts or just want to talk?
I know that you called black youth super predators in 1994. Please explain the record. Explain it to us. You owe black people an apology.
Well,
excuse us.
That's inappropriate. If you will give me a chance to talk, I'll approach your side. You know what? Nobody's ever asked me before. You're the first person to ask me, and I'm happy to address it, but you are the first person to ask me here. Okay, back to the issues.
It's now debunked, but it was a theory that suggested a small but significant and increasing population of impulsive, often urban youth were willing to commit crimes without remorse, violent crimes without remorse. So,
Meet this young man. What's your name, young man?
Derek Smith,
Derek Smith. How old are you, Derek?
17.
And what's happened to you recently since October 23rd?
Me and my mother was walking down the street, and they said that I looked suspicious. So they came over to me, and they asked me a couple of questions, and I gave them my answers. And then they told me to pull down my pants.
In front of your mother?
In front of my mother. And my mother was like, "Why are you doing this?" I was like, because they wanted me to do it, Mom. And then my mother was arguing with the police officer and everything. So they took me around the corner, they pulled down my pants, and they started checking me under my pants because they thought I was selling, like, drugs. No, they just put it in the car because she was getting disorderly. She was, like, having a brawl with the cops, telling them why did they do it.
Did the cops find anything?
No, they didn't have nothing on it.
What time of day was this? During the day, during the afternoon,
It was like
at night?
About 5:30 evening. Yes.
And where were you and your mother going?
We were going grocery shopping.
And they didn't search your body cavities, did they?
Yes, they searched under my pants and they was looking.
It's no coincidence that this disproportionately affected Black and brown youth. It is not up for debate. They are facts. You can look them up if you need to. This is not a debate. This is a perfect example of the legacy of hate and the legacy of violence that permeates. So the Central Park Five are victims of the super predator theory. Theory allowed people to see young Black kids and brown kids as not being children. So if you think about the crime that happened in 1984 with Bernard Goetz, and then you roll into the 90s and suddenly we have a super predator criminal, you can't deny the connection. It was never true, but people pushed it like it was. And the result of that is cases like the Central Park Five. That's because you thought you had the fuel for that fire in the super predator theory. And where did that get us? So it's important to recognize like what frame of mind people were in about youth culture, about the definition of a child in the cultural sense. The message is clear. Childhood's over. With Nightmare on Elm Street, we were numbing out. With Scream, we'd all but given up. And that's echoed even in how the film is structured, being meta, to come off of an era of satanic panic, false allegations and convictions, super predator false allegations and convictions, or simply just farming individuals. The opening scene with Drew Barrymore is a huge message of that. She's familiar, we know her, you don't expect anything to happen to her. So when he changed that pulse, of how this film would come across, how Scream would be conceptualized, he really focused on that juxtaposition. But one of the most important things that happened the same year that Scream came out was the development of Amber Alert. And that came about because of the still unsolved kidnapping, assault, and murder of Amber Hagerman. Amber Alert, or a child abduction emergency alert, this was a message distribution that could help people know when a child had been abducted. What are the things to look for? What should I report back to you if I see it? So this is a very powerful system that we still use today. We all get Amber Alerts all the time, right? So think about that, because Amber Hagerman was a young white girl. Drew Barrymore is getting slaughtered in the beginning of Scream, and us having to pick up the pieces without actually having a plan. You see that he's trying to address these cultural moments with race and sex and sexuality by eliminating Drew Barrymore right off the bat. So the juxtaposition of the Bernard Goetz case in 1984, Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984, the rise of the super predator theory from the 90s, and the Amber Alert that comes in 1996, it just culminates into a reality that definitively needs adults to know that there is no childhood and that that was a choice that we all made. So let's discuss Nightmare on Elm Street in depth using the resources I mentioned earlier and the formula that I created to analyze films. So the formula incorporates the following: project principles plus value tags plus mind maps. This is what I use every time I'm analyzing a film to ground myself and also to remember the purpose of what I'm creating and how I want it to come across to other people. I really want to share with everybody how that process works for me. And I also want to remind everyone of the exact resources we're going to use for Nightmare on Elm Street. So for Nightmare on Elm Street, we will be using project principles, value tags, and the mind map I created that examines core struggles of existence. One of the fundamental pieces of Nightmare on Elm Street that shines through for me every time is the scene where Freddy says, "This is God." This is a perfect example of the many concepts I touch on throughout my resources. The project principle that I feel is being exercised in this incantation of Freddy is we don't get to choose our victims, and we don't. So Freddy is a really complex figure, particularly when we are examining the notion of victimhood. It's almost impossible to categorize him strictly as a victim, even as the series unfolds and reveals more and more about his upbringing, his origins, the reasons behind his transformation. There's no excuse for the crimes he's committed in the Nightmare on Elm Street universe, but there are threads throughout the series that help us understand how moments like this go from a thought to an action. How do these things get put into motion? And the character of Freddy is really powerful at helping people examine those complexities. He complicates the notion of who even qualifies as a victim, and therefore he's complicating the idea of what a monster is, what it could be, what we allow it to be, what we wish it was so bad that we make it in theory. The parents are almost more paradoxical than Freddy is, because although you see where they're coming from, you're also experiencing them in the aftermath, and you're seeing how broken each of them are in their own way. The only people's parents you really experience are Nancy's, and although they are physically there, mentally they are both somewhere else. They're not part of the world she's actually in. It's as if they committed the crime to protect her from a monster that was real so she could live in a world that was a charade. Context surrounding a victim or a monster is just as important as your feelings about someone and their actions or inactions. This is not a black and white situation by any means where victim, monster. Freddy is definitely a puzzle that I don't think is meant to be solved. I think it is simply meant to create a force field of inquiry, of curiosity, this need for a deeper understanding rather than a surface, shallow, and frankly, immovable attitude that just goes, this is bad, this is good. We're all only human. So the concept of being all good or all bad simply doesn't apply anywhere except for a moral stage. That is a concept our culture has a hard time accepting, that the nuances will be our salvation, not the polarities. In terms of the value tag that I thought best applied here, I chose reimagination. Reimagination is all about redefining industry standards and film standards, but respecting past achievements and acknowledging the foundation that you are creating on top of. So this idea is particularly evident in this incantation of Freddy, for one reason only, and the main reason that we've been discussing so far is that it complicates the idea of a monster, of a villain. So redefining monstrosity can be really difficult. It has been attempted, and I would say it's been attempted and has been successful prior to Nightmare on Elm Street, but I would say that Nightmare on Elm Street does it the best because it doesn't feel like a lesson. Often when a lot of films do look into complicating the idea of a monster, it's a little shallow, and follow me because I'm not saying that the movies have no merit, but a great example would be The Elephant Man. So this is a familiar narrative about a presumed monster that we reveal to be good. And it's a reflection back on us of how we treat people, how we preconceive entire lives people have lived because of our interaction with them at one moment in time. So those are really powerful narratives, and I don't think they should go away. I think they're important, but I think they are a little bit short-sighted. It's asking us to really examine whether or not we truly understand what a victim is and what a monster is, or if we just interchange terms as it suits us and to our benefit to us looking good, to proving a point or an opinion, or is it a genuine need to understand? People often corrupt themselves and others, and this can lead to a silent, suffocating loop because we all have a reason not to speak up. And I think Nightmare on Elm Street is saying, we actually don't really want to know. We just never want to be called a monster. It goes without saying that A Nightmare on Elm Street is undoubtedly one of the most child-focused horror franchises in the history of the genre. Children are often at the center of every step in a Freddy film, and this theme persists throughout the series, or the franchise rather. No films exclude children from the narrative, whether that is through pregnancy or whether that is through the child being a key part of the story. So as I was thinking about Nightmare on Elm Street, specifically the first film, project principle that I thought applied a responsibility to bear witness. So this is present throughout the entire series. Notably, when you get to Freddy's Dead and you start to, grasp what the responsibility means and how it can impact so many outcomes, to witness pain, to witness suffering, to hear it, to believe it, and to reflect that back at someone, to notice that pattern about a responsibility to bear witness. And that essentially in Nightmare on Elm Street, the issue is there just isn't enough of that. It makes it pretty clear with all the various outcomes in all the chapters and all the small moments of pain that turn into entire films. And what's keeping this going is our cultural and social tendency to dismiss people's pain, call it hysteria, tell them to suck it up. Denying someone their pain is dangerous business. Another concept being worked out in Nightmare on Elm Street is creative destruction. So this refers to a transformation that arises from radical innovation. So Nightmare on Elm Street is an unequivocal hotbed of radical innovation. The use of creative destruction in Nightmare on Elm Street is palpable. There's a lot to learn from the Freddy films because of that innovation, and especially because of that innovation in storytelling. Okay. The core reason the genre gained popularity is that Freddy is a child killer, so it's tapping into a universal fear, one that most people can agree on. So the relatability to a villain like Freddy is remarkable in a society that does not tolerate harm to children, or at least presents that they don't want harm to come to children, because I don't know sometimes, suggesting a profound radical transformation within the narrative. It represents a creative destruction of traditional notions of what a monster is and challenges the understanding of who a victim is. So again, he's repeating that complication so that you can fully see like how nuanced this reality really is. And if you understand the nuance of reality, then you shift your reality from one of blame to one of resolution. That is what Nightmare on Elm Street can help you understand. Nightmare on Elm Street stands out because it traces Nancy's experience with that as a lead character, and then it also influences how we reflect on Freddy's character and Freddy's history. So that disconnection could potentially be the reason that we are automatically aligned with Freddy, because we don't really know Freddy when he was alive. We only really know Freddy as he's come back.
Taking justice into their own hands. When I was alive, I might have been a little naughty, but after they killed me, I became something much, much worse. The stuff nightmares are made of.
That is not a man. That is not a human. And yet he is more relatable than any character we interact with throughout the entire franchise. So that's a fascinating way to work, that creative destruction and that reimagination into a horror film. One of the aspects I really wanted to touch on that I noticed about Nightmare on Elm Street was that it is really tapped into Berlin Syndrome. So this was a film that came out a few years ago, but the concept of Berlin Syndrome applies beyond just the first film. It describes a scenario where one person becomes emotionally, physically, or psychologically trapped by another, often in romantic relationships or sexual encounters. Berlin syndrome is like being under a spell. It's like being trapped in yourself. And when we get the story of Amanda Kruger, Freddy's mom, this is a great example of she wasn't necessarily kidnapped. She wasn't necessarily forced to be in an environment, but psychologically, culture, society, religious beliefs had influenced her mind to the point where she couldn't think outside of those structures about how to move forward. The entire franchise is like breadcrumbs, revealing new dark chapters in the lives of children, emphasizing the central role that children play in horror narratives and in the horrors of life. I also like to highlight sustainability for the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, opposed to childhood, children, and children's culture. So themes of sustainability are prevalent throughout the film. Pregnancy, for example, represents a repetitive experience within the franchise. So Nightmare on Elm Street is diving into applying sustainability to situations where maybe it doesn't belong. It's not a typical story about a child killer because we're also getting into the lasting effects of individual action and the pre-existing conditions that shaped a life filled with those actions. The project principle I thought applied best here was subversion, or established does not equal best. Nothing that happens is quickly forgotten. It's very clear about the staying power of trauma and the effect of memory, and even how memory and knowledge affects the physical body. And in that sense, I think it does tie into this idea of postpartum depression. It's an expansive idea about postpartum depression, but it still applies, I think. I find the portrayal of postpartum depression as an invisible epidemic to be central to the narrative that works its way through the entire Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. So not just in the first film, that horror fans likely have a leg up on most people because we're dealing with those ideas more often than not. We're dealing with the complexities and the nuances and the changes and the gathering of information and then changing your opinion based on that. Like this experience is happening all the time, whereas other people have to pick a moment to have those thoughts. And I think horror film can kind of push you to have those moments where you're thinking about these things, so you don't have to put it into play. And so then it becomes a little less daunting, and it simply becomes about understanding the movie that's sitting in front of you, enjoying it, finding the different pieces, putting them together. Essentially, you get to put the puzzle together without knowing you're putting it together. That's what films can do, and that's especially what horror films can do, that nothing, and I mean nothing, no other art form, no other movie genre, nothing can do. Childbirth, women in pregnancy, they're all being fueled by that. But the most important is the cultural part. Watching Nancy's mom throughout the film, and especially in relation to her addiction, and the guilt for the crime, and the fact that she has a child who she's basically neglecting, experiences of mattering, of feeling safe, of feeling support. It's as if it stops with the practical and the physical, and then anything after that is just up to you to figure out. You're just modeling behavior that says bury things, don't solve them, don't resolve them, don't talk about them, bury them. And you're not just telling her this, you're acting it out, because whenever she'd like to get a word in, it's basically a dismissal. But postpartum depression is only understood and applied clinically, medically, biologically. It's the expectation. It's the expectation of what is a mother, and making that complex because, you're watching her suffering through being a parent. And, Nancy's mother comes off as overbearing, but she also comes off as actively avoiding any genuine interaction or connection with her family so that she can avoid the memories of what she knows she was part of. Postpartum depression runs all the way through the franchise, but especially as you look at, there's an overarching sense of absence. The film is so heavy with absence. Absence of people, not absence of material things, not absence of resources, absence of people, absence of attention, absence of care. So while these kids have everything a kid could want at that time, especially, they're not worried about anything really. They come from families that can help them. They come from situations where they haven't struggled, just to eat that day. So they're doing pretty good. You could argue that in the families, everyone is sort of just a planet orbiting each other. Like they're talking and they're obviously interacting, but it just feels like everyone's in a separate world when they're together. There doesn't feel like there's a lot of connection person to person. One of the strongest relationships in the film is Nancy and her best friend Tina. That's one of the only places that you see outright belief happening. She believes her immediately. She relates to her. She stays with her when she's scared. So all these things are Nancy's doing. And in this sense, she's very maternal. And you could even look at postpartum depression as an invisible epidemic as the pressure of motherhood that goes to people who are nurturing. There's a lot of people who are naturally caring, affectionate, they want to help people, they're empathetic. And that really ties into what is it like to be a parent without ever having a child? What is it like to assume the role of a parent among a group of friends? What does that take? And what kind of pressure is that for someone when there's no biological, background to go off of? How do you explain how postpartum could mutate into that? How do you explain that? Nightmare on Elm Street did a really good job of that with the immense disconnection between all of these kids and their parents. It's a pretty clear message about what happens when you think that it's someone else's job to ground your kids, to love your kids, to offer them the world. And that you think the world is an American Express card, but the rest is irrelevant. And that is the danger that Nightmare on Elm Street is trying to warn everyone about. So thanks for watching my lengthy discussion and listening to me for 30 plus minutes. Please reach out to me via my website, which you'll see all of that information at the end of the screen. So thanks again.